Hello to you, my very best friend. Welcome to another video, and this time I do actually mean another video, because today we are talking about this Roja Parfums Discovery Set again. I made a video about this same Discovery Set about 6 or 7 months ago probably, and while I don't think I necessarily got that review wrong, I would say that it was reactionary. At that point in time, I had just gotten the Discovery Set. I had just come off of 2 weeks of making videos every single day for a bracket style series that I did on my TikTok channel, and I think that for some of these, because I was stewing in these Roja fragrances for so long, I was a bit more critical in certain places than I needed to be, and also I think that there were cases where, because I was being so critical, I felt that I needed to be more positive in other areas to make up for it. So I do think that that video was, for the most part, pretty true at the time, but now, with the months that have since passed, with the time I have had away from these fragrances, I would like to make a video that is more indicative of my final thoughts on these fragrances rather than my initial reactions to them. So let's get into it. Let's kick this off with the only real losers on this list so far. I think I have come to enjoy all of these fragrances much more for the most part, but there are 2 that have sort of dropped in my estimation. Those being actually the 2 carded samples that I got alongside the Discovery Set. Those being Elysium Parfum and Isola Sol. Really, with both of these fragrances, it kind of comes down to price, which is something that I think is sort of silly to consider when you're talking about Roja fragrances. These are some of the most expensive fragrances on the market, and I would personally say that none of them are worth their price, but at the same time, these fragrances aren't made for people like me. They are not made for people who can't afford them. They're not made for people who need to skimp and save and and haw about whether they think it's worth the price. No, these are fragrances that are made for people who don't even really need to look at the price tag. And so by and large, I kind of ignore the price of these fragrances, but these 2 specifically are the most egregious examples, in my opinion, of not being worth the Roja price tag. Elysium Parfum, in keeping with the Elysium DNA that we'll get back to later in this video, is a very safe designer fragrance, or designer-like, I should say. It is a pretty simple fruity floral. The only difference is something in here. I don't know whether it's the cyclamen, I'm really not sure, but it makes it smell like hairspray. I have been a fragrance fan for many years, and it takes a lot to give me a headache nowadays, but this will do it. Of course, like all of these other Roja fragrances, the quality is super high, but in terms of scent profile, it's not particularly special, and again, it is legitimately painful to wear. Of course, it being Parfum, it is made for women, so it's kind of difficult for me to accurately give a rating to this, and so I sort of think, if I was with a girl, would I enjoy it if she was wearing this? And the answer is no. I think it is far too simple and far too harsh for how much money you're paying. Similarly, Isola Sol, I think smells pretty good, but again, it is nothing special. It smells pretty much exactly like sunscreen. And that's it. It is very strong, probably the longest lasting of all of these Roja fragrances, but it is very linear. There's not really any depth to it. It's not like it's sunscreen with like a boozy undertone or like a warm ambery base or anything. No, it is just, if you imagine what sunscreen smells like in your head right now, that's exactly what Isola Sol smells like. I definitely wouldn't call either of these fragrances horrible. Obviously, they're very well crafted, but I do think that with both of these, you can get the same thing from other fragrances for far less than you would be paying for either of these. I believe in the initial video I gave them like 4.5s or 5s out of 10. Now I'm going to drop these down to 2.5s out of 10. Okay, next up into the Discovery Set proper. The first one that I wanted to talk about was Scandal. In the first iteration of this video, I gave Scandal a 2 out of 10, and in the time since, my thoughts on it haven't changed. I still don't like Scandal. I still do not like fougères. Personally, fougères are my least favorite genre of perfumery. I know that there are people in the community who really like them and appreciate them for their classic qualities, and I really do admire that, and I think it's cool, but I think that makes up such a small portion of the people who wear fougères. When I think of fougères, I think of old guys who want to smell the way they did 40 years ago, who think that men nowadays just want to smell like women. There's that mental image in my head that I just can't get past. However, even though I do not like fougères, even though I do not like Scandal, I have come to appreciate it more. And more than anything, I wanted to recant something I said in the last review. I think I said something along the lines of Scandal smells like if you combined Dracar Noir with Lemon Pledge. Now, that is partly true. It has that same Drakkar Noir Fougere vibe, and in terms of the lemon pledge, actually on the back of this discovery box you can see that there are ingredients listed, and under Scandal they have limonene, which is an aroma chemical that is used in cleaning products. From what I understand, it is because it is a very long-lasting lemony smell, and for whatever scientific reason that is beyond my understanding, it is also strong enough to withstand the harsh chemicals that are in cleaning products. But with that said, one day I was going to the gym and I wasn't really feeling it, and so I thought, oh, I'll put on Drakkar Noir just to give me the hair on my chest, the extra manly power I need to lift these heavy weights. And so I thought, I'll put my money where my mouth is. I will put Drakkar Noir on one arm and I will put Scandal on the other. And it was night and day. Having Scandal on one arm was like wearing a very expensive, high-quality leather loafer, and having Drakkar Noir was like wearing a plastic bag. No, Scandal might not be my favorite, but it is far better than any of the alternatives that I have tried thus far, and even though I don't like it, I am embarrassed to give it a 2 out of 10. So I think I'm gonna bump it up to, I'll be a little bit generous. I will give Scandal a 4.5 out of 10. So moving on, we are going to talk about Vetiver. In my initial video, I gave this a 2 out of 10, and funny enough, now this is my favorite of these fragrances. At the time, I really did not like Vetiver, the ingredient, not the fragrance necessarily. I really could not wrap my head around it until shortly after I got that discovery set, when I got a sample of a fragrance called Astronaut by Nishand, and that sort of warmed me up to the idea of Vetiver. And then shortly after that, I started actually working with the raw material itself, and I flipped completely. It went from being my least favorite ingredient to my most. A real Vetiver like this, I'll do a close-up on it so you can see just how dark the color is. It's really unlike anything else. It is this deep, rich, smoky, almost kind of nutty type of woody smell. Roja's Vetiver kind of cuts back on a lot of that, and rightfully so. I found in my experiments that Vetiver can kind of wind up smelling a little bit like cigarettes, which is obviously not very desirable. Roja's Vetiver smooths out a lot of the harsher aspects to it. It adds a cleanliness and a almost soapiness to it. It also adds some fruits. It gives it this citrusy quality that adds sweetness to what would otherwise be a very harsh fragrance. At the time I said that it was a fougere, which is not true. At the time I said it was classical, which is true, and I have come around to enjoying that particular aspect of it. The one thing that I will dock it points for is something that I actually heard Aaron Terrence Hughes talk about in his video about Vetiver, and which was something that I accidentally discovered firsthand. I was in Disneyland about a month ago, and unbeknownst to me, there was a Guerlain store just smack dab in the middle of it, and they had none of the Guerlain fragrances that I wanted to try except for Guerlain's Vetiver, and unfortunately, Roja's Vetiver and Guerlain's Vetiver smell pretty much identical. I would say that Guerlain's Vetiver is a little more base heavy and Roja's Vetiver is a little more top heavy, which I do prefer. I find that Roja's Vetiver is airier and lighter, but that is a very small detail that a lot of the people around you probably won't notice. And while I do think that Roja's Vetiver just barely edges out the Guerlain Vetiver, it's also twice the price. I believe that I have seen Guerlain's Vetiver for between $80 and $100, whereas Roja's Vetiver is into the low 200s. So unfortunately it does lose out just a little bit there, but it is still a wonderful fragrance. I think it is probably my favorite maybe of all of these. I'm gonna give Roja's Vetiver a 9.5 out of 10. A big swing from being formerly a 2 out of 10. Okay, next up is Apex, and my thoughts on Apex really haven't changed all that much. It smells an awful lot like Sauvage Elixir. It is a warm, spicy, woody, very manly fragrance. If I'm in the right mood for it, I enjoy it a fair bit. But unfortunately, and I touched on this in the last video, there's just something about it that goes sour on my skin. I don't know if that's the fragrance or if that's just how it wears on my skin. I find the opening 45 minutes to an hour is fantastic, and after that there's something kind of animalic, leathery, almost kind of powdery and soapy that really takes hold of everything. And while it doesn't smell awful, it just makes it a bit more unpleasant. Again, sometimes I'm in the mood for that, but most times I'm not. If the dry down was more similar to the opening, I think I would like this a whole lot more, but unfortunately that strange sourness really just brings this down a couple notches for me. It's not my favorite, but I don't hate it. I'm going to keep Apex where it was and give it a 6 out of 10. Next up is Danger, which was a fragrance that I liked a fair bit, but has only grown on me in the time since the first review. I think that this is in the vein of a fougere, but it is almost made more Middle Eastern. In that first review, I likened it to Xerjoff's Alexandria 2. I still think that they are somewhat similar, but maybe that's just a point of reference that I have in my head. said. Alexandria 2 is much spicier, much harsher, but Danger is almost kind of like a westernized take on that DNA. It has that spice, but it is sort of smoothed and rounded. It's made soapier and cleaner, but it still manages to maintain that Eastern vibe. It's very interesting and manages to be different while at the same time being easy to wear. Every time I spray it on, I think it grows on me a little bit more. Right now, I am going to give Danger an 8 out of 10. Next, we will talk about Elysium and Elysium Eau Intense. Much like how Elysium Parfums was Roja's take on a simple, safe designer-style DNA, the regular Elysium is Roja's take on a blue fragrance. At first, I wasn't super crazy about Elysium. I thought it was just kind of standard. I recognized that the quality was there, but the DNA itself didn't really move me. But in the time since, I've come to appreciate it far more. It has that blue shower gel, semi-aquatic vibe to it that you would expect from a blue fragrance. It does that at the highest quality, and it also adds in elements of greenery and herbs. Those are very small touches that make it unique, make it stand out, that put it, in my opinion, at the top of the heap of blue fragrances. I really think it smells great. Again, though, the problem is just the performance. In general, I sort of have mixed feelings about performance. Obviously, there are some fragrances that you just cannot get performance out of, just given their chemical nature. I also don't think that performance should necessarily be a prerequisite for purchasing something. And frankly, when I have fragrances that last for like 10 to 12 hours, I just kind of get sick of them. But I also kind of think that there is a floor to this. If this is the floor, I don't think it matters whether the performance is like here or off the screen. But when it starts to go below this line, that's kind of when I have a problem with it. If it's a cheaper fragrance, it's not as big of a deal, but if it's something that costs you $200 or more, that's kind of a problem for me. And yeah, unfortunately, in the time since the performance on Elysium, having sat in the case for the past 6 months or so, it hasn't gotten any better. In ideal conditions, it still caps out at around 2 or 3 hours. Even though I love the smell, even though I think it's one of the best blue fragrances available on the market, I just can't justify the cost when compared to other similar fragrances. But boy, it sure smells good, and I actually like the way it smells even more now than I did when I made the first video. And in that first video, I actually ranked Elysium Eau Intense above the normal Elysium, and now I'm going to flip them. Elysium Eau Intense takes the Elysium DNA and it adds greenery and it adds rhubarb. It all comes together to give it this prickly, kind of minty quality, something that I likened in that first video to being kind of like a Jolly Rancher. And at first, I really loved that, but over the course of this past summer, wearing this a lot, I kind of got sick of it. I don't know if that's necessarily the most accurate way to put it, but that one sharp, clean, minty note went from being the thing that I liked about it to being the thing that kind of makes me hesitant about it. It just kind of got on my nerves. Don't get me wrong, I still think that it's great, and I think that Eau Intense improves upon Elysium's performance issues. Eau Intense lasts me the better part of 4 to 6 hours, sometimes even more, depending on the conditions. But just in terms of smell alone, the regular Elysium is one that I've come to enjoy more, and Elysium Eau Intense is one that I've come to enjoy just a little bit less. I am going to give the regular Elysium an 8.5, and Elysium Eau Intense let's give it a 7.5 out of 10. And lastly, we have Enigma or Creation Eve, depends on where you are. I really liked this fragrance in the last video, and I still do. My only issue with it last time was that the opening was so good, and the dry down was just a little bit of a disappointment. You start out with this gorgeous, sparkling, fizzy, Coca-Cola type smell, and that is incredible. And then after that, it dries down into this mix of cognac and leather and vanilla that is still good, but it doesn't quite reach the heights of the opening. In that first video, the discrepancy between these two elements really bothered me, but now having spent more time with the fragrance, having gotten used to what it becomes in the dry down, I like it a whole lot more than I did. I still think it's fantastic, and I think of these 9 fragrances, this is the standout. For me, fragrances like these are kind of what indie and niche perfumery are all about. I don't quite remember what I gave it in that first video, I think maybe an 8.5, but now I'm going to bump it up to a 9. I think that Enigma is wonderful. I think that of all of these fragrances, if you have not done so already, this is the one that you should aim to get your nose on first. So there you have it. That has been this video. I feel much better about this. I was looking back on that video where I was sitting like back here. The backlighting was horrible, and I was sitting on a stool where I was really uncomfortable and kind of slouching over for most of it. And I just think that these ratings are more accurate, and again, more indicative of my final thoughts, having now worn these fragrances over the past 6 months, rather than having worn them for a couple of days. If only all reviews could be this way. Anyways, that is going to do it for me. Thank you so much for watching. I really do appreciate it. And as always, I will see you later. Goodbye.